Good evening. I'm John Batchelor. My professionals join. A lot of politics on the Monday before July 4th. Congress is busy, and we're busy watching Congress. Tonight, one particular member of Congress, Thad Cochran, the sitting senator of Mississippi, who wins his special primary, his runoff against State Senator Chris McDaniel. My colleague and co-host at WJR, Thaddeus McCotter, continues with me, and we're joined by David Drucker, writing in the Washington Examiner on John Cochran's unlikely upset of an upset, and John Fund of the National Review Online to comment on these accusations of voter irregularities by the McDaniel camp. Mr. Drucker, a very good evening to you. First, how did Thad Cochran do it? How did he grow his vote to win by, 6,000 or 7,000 votes? Good evening to you, David.
Good evening, John. And, when they told me how they were going to do it, I didn't put much stock in it, but it was really the only strategy they had. And I think what people need to understand about Mississippi is that they don't register people by party, and all primaries are open. And if you didn't vote, as long as you didn't vote in the other party's primary, you're eligible to vote in the runoff, whether or not you voted in the primary. And so what the Cochran campaign did was go after, first, a bunch of Republicans who they say supported Cochran but didn't bother to show up because he's won easily for decades, never had any competition. And number two, and they were very open about it, went after Democrats, people who identify as Democrats, African Americans. And Cochran, instead of trying to sort of compete with McDaniel on, his conservatism, basically said, I am what I am, which is a big government Republican who brings home the bacon, and I've done it for years, and if you elect the other guy, it might all stop. And that includes, from the perspective of the Cochran campaign, that included disaster relief aid, money for a shipyard on the coast of Mississippi, infrastructure projects and things like that has really been important to Mississippi in terms of the people who live there, how they look at it. And so that's what he did. And because the Cochran campaign itself wasn't that good at voter turnout, which is, again, when you've had a member of Congress who's never had to work for it, or at least not since the 80s, your campaign skills tend to atrophy. The Republican establishment there, the outside forces led by Haley Barbour, his nephew Henry Barbour, and others, put together their own ground games and coordinated amongst themselves in all of the counties. And, they know where every vote can possibly be found because they've done this for so long, and they put it together, and that's how they did it.
Mr. Fund, you say there are voting irregularities. Will the McDaniel camp continue to protest and take this to courts?
Well, it depends if they have access to all of the voting records in the various Mississippi counties. When they went to Hinds County, which is Jackson, the state capital, they uncovered something like 1,700 people who had voted in the Democratic primary 3 weeks ago, but had also voted in the Republican runoff illegally. Those votes are invalid. In addition, tonight we have the Reverend Stevie Fieldler of the First Union Missionary Baptist Church, who has stepped forward and said he delivered, quote, hundreds or even thousands, unquote, of blacks to the polls after being offered money and being assured by a Cochran campaign operative that none of this would come to light. Quote, the Cochran campaign, told me to offer blacks $15 each and to vote for Thad, unquote. Now, this is the statement of only one perhaps disgruntled person, but if it turns out that the get out the vote money turned into buy the vote money, that is potentially serious if it actually is demonstrated.
Thaddeus, you have a question for either.
Well, yes. Isn't part of this the fact that it's a deeply red state and that the chances for mischief in such a primary runoff are very large?
Well, part of it is, again, what David pointed out, there is no party registration. But even so, you are not allowed to vote in another party's primary if you've already voted in your own party's primary.
And David, at this point, is the Cochran campaign preparing? Are they hiring lawyers? Are they preparing to adjudicate this?
Well, I have no doubt that they're prepared to do whatever they need to. I keep checking in, and the people that I check with that are monitoring this don't think there's any there. They're not concerned, and they think there may have been possibly some clerical errors, but they're just not worried about it, and they don't think that what the McDaniel campaign it claims to have happened in any measurable sense. And all I would add about this is that in some ways it reminds me of the 2000 presidential election. We know, as a matter of fact, that it's not whether you win or lose the popular vote, but whether you have enough electoral votes. But when finally, for the first time in 100 and some odd years, somebody wins the election through the electoral college and not the popular vote, everybody's up in arms about the whole process. And, the way Mississippi's election laws are, it never really mattered and never had been an issue. And Cochran, being up against the ropes, went ahead and did this in a way that was unseemly, and it's understandable that it has really angered a lot of McDaniel supporters and conservatives. But he followed the law, barring 7,000 plus illegal votes, and it's the kind of thing that's never mattered until it did.
Gentlemen, I want to move to the politics of the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, because it was much in the news today with the Supreme Court decisions, two of them. The Hobby Lobby decision about religious beliefs of a corporate owner, a closely held corporation, and then also Harris versus Quinn in the state of Illinois about whether unions could require dues from people who were home care visitors who were not part of the union. I'd like each of you to comment on the idea that the Affordable Care Act in the news again. Is this good or bad for the Democrats? Is this good or bad for the Republicans? I'll start with you, David. Talking about the Affordable Care Act, which has been out of the news for months because the HHS, CMS are no longer giving us big data. And we're not seeing any way to talk about this, but suddenly it's in the news because of a Supreme Court decision. Who does this favor, David?
Well, I think it depends how you look at it. I have no doubt that given today's Supreme Court decisions, Democrats are raising a lot of money online from their small committed donors, and so probably financially they did pretty well today because of the decision. But I think if you're an opponent of the Affordable Care Act, if you think that the president has overstepped his bounds in how he has applied this law and chosen to administer it, then you have to feel good about the law and it has to energize you. And in that respect, I think it was good for Republicans, and it probably gives them confidence that, if they're in control of something, that they can actually do something about this, and it's not just a fait accompli. So politically, both sides probably were able to take something away from this. I have no doubt that the president and the administration were not happy with the decision, and so there's no way for them to consider it a victory, regardless of who else does.
Mr. Funn, does this favor the Republicans to talk about the Affordable Care Act, if just for a night before July 4th?
Democrats will certainly do well with small donors, but I think this will just remind Americans that the Affordable Care Act was a wrenching change, and none of the change is good for most of the people experiencing it. And in November, the more the Affordable Care Act is in voters' minds, the less well Democrats will do.
I happen to have present as my colleague tonight someone who voted against the Affordable Care Act as many times as possible. How do you read this, Thaddeus, politically, with 5 months to go for the election?
Politically, I think the small donors' contributions will not outweigh the reticence that the Democrats have of even discussing this issue. The silence on the Affordable Care Act for the past couple months, relatively speaking, has been kind of an oasis of lack of discussion of it for the Democrats. They do not want to talk about this, and money from small donors is not going to help them if they have to.
And Thaddeus, your vote against the Affordable Care Act, is there a society like the Grand Army of the Republic where you're all going to gather someday? I voted against the Affordable Care Act.
Yes, it's called an insane asylum.
Come on, Thaddeus. This is the biggest drama between the Republican Party and Mr. Obama these last years. Do you have a sense that the Democrats have regret creating this wedge?
Well, I think that some of them do, the ones that were on the fence. I can't speak for them, but I don't hear them touting it in the private sector where many of them lost their seats. And I think historically, when people look back on this as a political matter, they were insane to have passed this legislation prior to redistricting. They had everything going for them. They could have drawn the lines, and they decided to do this instead. Thank you, Democrats.
Thaddeus McCotter, WJR, the great voice of the Great Lakes. John Fund of the National Review Online. David Drucker of the Washington Examiner. My professionals. When we come back, the president has two issues that will continue to weigh on the administration. One is at the border with Mexico, and the other is in Baghdad. The attack of now the Islamic State on the Maliki government. I'm John Batchelor.